I hope that by now you've been able to notice clues in the text of Matthew that are very particular to this gospel, that give us insight into some of the axes that Matthew has to grind, and also into some of the opportunities that we have to, uh, to theorize in an educated way about Matthew's context, Matthew's provenance, Matthew's city, Matthew's goals. And to this end, I want you to turn to Mark chapter 7, and we're going to perform something that's commonly called redaction criticism. We're going to look at the way that Matthew has edited material that we believe he has taken from Mark that give us insight into Matthew's community. We must always remember that Matthew isn't writing to us, and Matthew isn't writing to the generation of the historical Jesus, even though obviously he's chronicling that era. Matthew is writing to his later church. So if we look at Mark chapter 7, we see Jesus debate with the Pharisees over matters of ceremonial cleanliness, and Jesus calls the crowd to him in verse 14 of Mark 7 and says, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean." Verse 17, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean, for it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body?" And then Matthew interprets the application of the parable Mark does for his community by saying, in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. End of story. Now flip back to Matthew chapter 15, where we're going to find the same story, often copied verbatim, a bit more flowery in general, but the core of the story, much of it copied verbatim from Mark. So you'll recognize in Matthew 15 verse 10, Jesus called the crowd once again and to him and said, "Listen and understand, what goes into a man's mouth does not make him unclean, but what comes out of his mouth, that is what makes him unclean." And verse 15, Peter comes and says, "Explain the parable to us." Jesus once again chides them, "Are you still so dull?" and gives the whole thing about what comes out of the body, or what comes out of the mouth and the heart, rather, make a man unclean, with the summary statement, "These are what makes a man unclean, but eating with unwashed hand does not make him unclean." What I want you to see is that Matthew leaves out Mark's editorial about declaring all foods clean, because for Matthew, perhaps this would have been offensive to the Jewish Christian constituency, the conservative Jewish Christian constituency that was a central part of this community that had a role in birthing this very text of Matthew. So when we do redaction criticism, and Matthew is a wonderful opportunity to do so. We compare Matthew with Q and with Mark, and it allows us insights into Matthew's trajectory, Matthew's audience, and Matthew's context.